Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending what I think will be an extremely interesting session. We have two distinguished panelists today. I could spend 20 minutes easily describing their backgrounds and biographies, but in the interest of time, I'll be extremely brief. We have Sir John Major, who was Prime Minister of the UK from 1990 to 1997. He presided over a victory in the first Gulf War and a period of extraordinary prosperity. We also are lucky to have Ambassador Richard Fisher, who has just recently retired from 10 years as President and CEO of the Dallas Federal Reserve. He's been a member of the Monetary Policy Committee for the Federal Reserve, and we will be discussing today the widening gulf between the haves and the have-nots and how the world should be responding. I will be starting off the discussion today with some questions that I will address to Sir John and Ambassador Fisher, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience. Let me start with a political question for Sir John. Let me ask you how rising inequality is affecting politics in your country, the UK, and globally.
I think it's becoming a very serious issue, not just in my country, but almost everywhere. And I think many people look at it as though it is predominantly an economic question. But in fact, in many ways, it's predominantly a political question, and it's having a very significant political effect. And I think there are a number of component factors. Some people blame quantitative easing, but I think that is an unfair description of what is happening. Quantitative easing has certainly helped the wealthy to get wealthier. It certainly hasn't made the poor get any poorer. What has made a really big difference is the impact of the global market, globalization. That has lifted some people from the very poorest a little, but it has made a much bigger change to the wealth of those at the top and thus widened the gap. And what that has tended to do is to open up all sorts of resentments and difficulties politically. And it is becoming a serious political issue. And we'll no doubt come to the solutions to that a little later. But it is an issue that it has been possible to brush aside because the poor were getting poorer for quite a long time. It's become impossible to brush aside because of the 6 or 7 years of relative austerity in so much of the world, because of the financial crisis starting in 2007, which has made life much harder for many people. So now it's moved up the political agenda to an extent that I would not have imagined a few years ago, and it is an issue that can no longer be denied.
Ambassador Fisher, let me...
May I thank the Prime Minister for not blaming QE.
I'll take my fee now.
Ambassador Fisher, let me ask you an economics-related question. Some have argued that inequality isn't just a political issue, but that it hurts economic growth and stability. Would you agree with this proposition? And if so, what are the economic ramifications of rising inequality?
Well, in the United States, we have an issue which is very significant, and that is that we've seen over the last 15 years no job creation in the two middle-income quartiles. Now, being an American, I don't believe in classes, but I do believe in income quartiles. And if you have stagnation in what I consider to be the muscle and sinew of a society, which is the middle-income groups, then I think you create discomfort. And as I said earlier at another panel, being a Texan, particularly if we were to secede from the Union statistically, we've had job destruction in the middle-income quartiles for over 15 years. Jobs are the root to dignity. If you don't have a job, you don't have an income. If you don't have an income, you cannot build wealth, and you have no chance to climb up the ladder. We've seen a growth in the highest income quartile, and we've seen, given our social support programs, stability in the lowest income quartile. But this is something people do not talk about enough. And I think that is the real issue for our economy, because consumption is driven by middle-income quartiles. I want to come back to a point that Sir John made, which is he's absolutely right in my opinion. The quantitative easing has made the rich and the quick richer. The theory of quantitative easing was by making asset markets richer, that was the benefit. But there was a cost to those that lived on fixed income streams. But eventually it would lead to further job creation because corporations would have the means, having improved their balance sheets and so on, to hire more people and provide them more access. And that has not yet obtained to the degree that we thought that might occur. But everything that you make, and the Prime Minister understands this better than anybody else, every decision you make, there's a cost-benefit trade-off. But there so far has been a great cost to those that worked by the sweat of their brow, saved their money, did all the prudent things you're supposed to do. Their savings have been decimated, whereas the very rich have done extremely well.
Let me turn again to you, Sir John, and ask you, given the trends we've been seeing, should governments be taking action to reduce inequality and improve opportunities? And if so, what should be done? And if not, who should be taking action?
Well, there's no silver bullet that on its own is going to solve this problem. And there are a range of things that need to be done, and a significant number of them would be done directly or indirectly as a result of government policy. If you pick up the point Richard made a moment ago, essentially about the dignity of labor and people who are not working, you have to ask yourself why many of them are not working, and there are a range of different reasons. In many parts of my country, for example, and this applies to other areas, there are high pockets of unemployment because the infrastructure makes it an inappropriate place for people to invest. So one of the things, plainly a matter of government policy, is to open up those areas. It may be a new road, it may be a new port, it may be a new airport, something to open up that particular part of a country to investment, because that investment will create jobs, those jobs will create income, that income will reduce inequality. So there's a whole range of things like that that government can and should do. You may, for example, also consider the option of what we might call enterprise zones, where you go to areas of very high unemployment and relative poverty, and you create particular incentives for employers to invest there. Now, they are perfectly legitimate actions for a government to take. And if the government take those actions, they are, by doing so, make it more likely that the private sector is going to invest in those particular areas. And I think unless governments wish to have a social problem that spirals out of control, they are going to have to look at that. In many parts of the world, we are getting an underclass who find from generation to generation that they have no jobs, or jobs that have such a low income that they're unable to improve their own circumstances. And in a world that by and large is getting richer, that simply isn't acceptable. And it has a political ramification in that it creates resentment, and resentment creates the formation of many undesirable political groupings. And you can see that, for example, across Europe as a result of austerity. Some really rather extreme political parties have arisen. At the moment, they're an irritation, but unless you address that problem, they'll become more of an irritation over the next decade or so.
Ambassador Fisher, we have a room filled with investors. Does rising inequality have implications for capital markets?
Well, it makes the rich richer, as pointed out. These people manage money for rich people and rich institutions. But underlying financial markets ultimately are real economies. I think Sir John just made a very important point. If you undermine the fabric of those countries, then obviously markets cannot continue to progress. And I do want to follow up on a point that he made. We saw a rise of the End the Fed movement, the Occupy movement in the United States. These, to me, are expressions of frustration, of somehow a maldistribution that's occurred. In the eyes of some, basically financed or perpetuated by the central bank. But ultimately, I think there is a role for governments, and I'm sure that Sir John would agree with me, in high value-added societies like the UK and the United States, but everywhere. There is a role for education as well. Mm. And he's absolutely right about infrastructure. But since we are here right before the funeral of a great leader, Lee Kuan Yew, not only took a company with a per capita income of $500 per annum to $50,000, and has a fairly narrow Gini coefficient, as they say, the spread between poor and rich, but did it very significantly, both through infrastructure and through education. We have huge skills mismatches in the developed countries, as they used to be called. And we also have, as Sir John pointed out, real challenges that come from something that was a victory that he helped achieve and others that went before him, which is we won the Cold War. We went from creative destruction to creative competition, brought more people into the labor markets. We have a duty to move our people upward the value-added ladder. And we have done a miserable job, at least in my country, with regard to education and increasing the skill set. And until that's done, I really don't see this disparity being decreased. In fact, I'm seeing it widening.
Can I add 2 points to that? Because I strongly agree with that. But I think there are 2 points when one's talking of education. I think we have a huge mismatch across Europe between the quantum of academic education and the quantum of skilled education.
Very good point.
I think we're going to have to move more and more to a position where we have as many universities and technical colleges for practical skills as we have for academic skills. That hasn't been the tradition. It will need to be the tradition in the future. And the other thing where I think you're going to need a tremendous change of mindset and will be extraordinarily politically difficult, in many parts of the world, what their economies most need is immigration, and what their residents most dislike is immigration, because they're aging societies and they need young people to come and power their economy. And that's not only true in the West. You might, for example, think of Japan. And of course, immigration upsets the established rationale within the country, and people often don't like it, and it has social difficulties. But economically, the more we get that sort of free movement, the better employed those economies are actually going to be. I'm sorry, forgive me adding to your point.
No, but as a son of immigrants, I agree with you.
May I ask you about tax policy? And I'd like to hear what ideas both of you have. It has been proposed, mainly by people on the left, that tax policy is an effective tool in combating inequality. Do you consider this an appropriate public policy tool? And for, say, developed countries like the US and the UK, do you consider current income taxes, personal and corporate, to be appropriate, too low, too high? Maybe we could start with Sir John.
Well, I think taxes are a secondary point in tackling this problem. They're not a primary point. There are some things that taxes can do, but by and large, I don't think it's taxes. I think in terms of developing the country to make it suitable for jobs, public expenditure has a bigger role to do than taxes. So, of course, that's secondary because the public expenditure is funded by taxes, of course. But I think just to make tax changes, you can make tax changes at the bottom to alleviate poverty. And I think most countries are doing that, and it helps. It has some drawbacks, actually, that people tend not to acknowledge, but I think that does help. I don't think the concept of punitively taxing those who are well off actually makes a really significant difference. I think the advantage that you may gain in revenue is often offset by the disadvantage of what you lose in investment. So I can see, for political reasons, you might wish to push up taxes to a certain level. But by and large, I'm not a fan of high taxes. In my experience, the public and the individual uses money better than the government. And so I'm not in favor, generally, of significant rises in taxes. I think it has a minor role in this particular development and a secondary role.
Ambassador Fisher?
Couldn't agree more. And I come from a state within the United States that has no income tax.
I'm extremely sorry to say that I don't.
Again, if you look at the amount of job creation that's taken place in Texas, absolutely astonishing. Not, by the way, in the lowest income quartiles. It's all four. And I think you have to be very careful, at least in our culture in the United States. And thanks to the transformations that the Prime Minister and his predecessor made in England, the best form of job creation comes through the private sector. And government, of course, plays its role. But I think if you're thinking about tax policy, the issue should be how do you incentivize the private sector, to come back to QE3, to take advantage of the massive amounts of money that we put into the system as central banks and utilize it for job creation and wealth creation. So what we do as central banks is we fill the petrol tank, the gas tank. Someone has to incentivize businesses to step on the accelerator and move the car of the economy forward through job creation. That is an issue for fiscal authorities and governments. That's where we've had a great failure in our own country, in a Congress that's dysfunctional and can't make decisions. So I couldn't agree more, and particularly given where I come from, where we have no income tax. Although, Prime Minister, we also have a state government that only meets for 140 days every 2 years. We're convinced if it was 2 days every 140 years, we'd be even more prosperous than we are.
We have a room filled with people who are moving capital globally at blindingly fast speeds. Sir John, you mentioned the role of global markets. Could we speak about globalization as a force for inequality, and not just global capital flows, but global trade flows? Do you consider globalization a force that is increasing inequality, reducing opportunity in countries, or is it a pure good? And maybe, again, if I could start with Sir John.
I don't think I've hardly ever come across anything that's a pure good. I think you have to draw a distinction between inequality, that is the gap between the highest incomes and the lowest, and poverty. Because the way in which the global market has been working has been to lift people out of poverty. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And that is, of course, an excellent thing. But it is also, because of the concentration on the way it has accelerated wealth, widened the gap between the rich and the poor. So it has both lifted people out of poverty, which is excellent, but it has also widened inequality, which has created a great deal of resentment. And globalization has done both of those things. One, plainly good. The other carries with it a great deal of difficulty. I have no objection to people getting richer. I am concerned when the poor don't get better off. So I'm unconcerned about what happens at the top. But that doesn't alter the fact that it is a political reality that if you get rising levels of inequality, human nature will create resentment and human nature will create political problems. So that is something that the global market has done and something that governments are going to have to tackle in one form or another. It isn't easy to know how to do it. You could, for example, go down the route that the left would advocate, and you could go for very high taxes. You could go for wealth taxes. As I indicated in my last answer, that causes more problems than it solves. And so I think you really need to focus government action on creating the capacity for those who are at the bottom to improve their own circumstances. And that involves not just the investment I referred to and the education that Richard referred to, but a range of other things. And at the bottom end, tax policy would also, of course, have a role to play. But there is no single thing that will do it. It's a whole range of policies. And I just wish I saw, across the world generally, a much greater determination to understand that poverty at the bottom is a problem that will cause immense social difficulties unless it is tackled and tackled vigorously. And I don't myself believe that it is being tackled sufficiently vigorously. You can find pretty wealthy countries in Europe that have some of the poorest regions in Europe. And they haven't tolerated those poorest regions because they feel outside society, they don't vote, they're lost, and they're left behind. And the other thing that globalization has done is put a premium on particular skills. If you have a skill that our modern society requires, then you are probably going to be very well remunerated for it. But you may have an academic skill that is attractive, but isn't actually required by commerce and industry, and that is often now being under-rewarded. So you're beginning to see a lot of people, well-educated, with university degrees, who actually find themselves unable to find a job that is commensurate with their abilities. And that is another problem that is increasingly beginning to arise as a result of the way the global market is moving.
Well, having been a deputy trade minister for my country and participated in WTO accession for China, et cetera, I'm a fan of globalization. It's much better than the world that we had before. As I said in an earlier panel, we used to have a G6, now we have a G-whiz. There are so many Gs and so many participants. But that's what we fought for, that's what we won, and that's good. But it does put enormous pressures on what used to be considered the developed countries. As Sir John said, we brought not only hundreds of millions, we brought billions of people that weren't participating into the workforce. China, and then India as a reaction to China and so on, in terms of their participation in their activity. But again, what this does is it forces us to move up the value-added ladder. And unless you have the means to do that, education systems, infrastructure systems, incentives that are provided to those that create jobs, and the skill sets to do that, you're going to have the natural result of widening inequality. I think globalization is a good thing. I spent most of my life negotiating that. But you have to have a response. And this is where governments have to be adaptive, particularly fiscal authorities. Again, I don't think this is a monetary policy issue. It really is an issue of how our political leaders and our regulators respond and provide incentives through for the private sector and for the educational system to adapt and make sure that we don't become victims of globalization, but instead profit from globalization.
There's one other point about globalization that people tend not to think of. And that is that globalization, in my judgment, is actually making the world a safer place than once it was. Mm-hmm. People are much less inclined to go to war with countries with which they have got a large degree of investment and in which they have a great interest. And globalization has brought people together in terms of trade and industry and commerce and socially in a way the world never had before. You often go to war and hate people, fear people about whom you know little. These days in a global world, we know a good deal more about countries in every corner of the world than we ever did before. And I think despite the problems we've got with the terrorist groups, which have risen in profile, overall the world is a good deal safer today than it has been at any stage in my lifetime. And I think globalization can take a good part of the credit for that because of the way in which the world has got to know one another and the way in which there are interlinked investments between nations on a scale we never believed possible even 20 years ago.
At this point, I'd like to open up the floor to questions from the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and we have microphones.
Thank you, everyone, for all your insights. They're definitely very valuable. I actually have two questions. The first question I would like to direct to Sir John. Previously, I read in the Financial Times a pretty long piece. They have this nice section called The Big Read on the rise of Manchester in the UK. And the arch of that piece is the rapidly increasing inequality that is London and everything else within the UK, which is definitely a big political theme. I think this is also something that Cameron also mentioned in various speeches, including the devolution of power after the recent Scottish vote, as we all know. How do you view this in terms of London versus the rest? Is this something sustainable? Do you think this is a problem in line with everything that we've mentioned in terms of inequality? That's my first question. For my second question, I'd like to direct to both of you on the issue of China. Inequality is definitely on the rise in China, probably surpassing any other nation in modern history in terms of its current pace of growth. I think you also you mentioned in terms of globalization, the role, whether it's in forms of taxation, the role of the state. This is also something closely tied to Lee Kuan Yew, which I think Richard also mentioned, so-called Asian values, the age-long debate of the role of society versus the state. Given the rapid rise in inequality today in China, and I believe both of you have mentioned the importance of government policy, what kind of policy suggestions or recommendations would you like to propose in order to help resolve this inequality problem in China? So first problem with UK, second problem China. Thank you.
Let me have first crack at the UK problem in London. London is the golden goose that pulls the UK along. And if you wish to put it in extreme form, you could almost say London is almost now becoming a nation state on its own, with a rising level of prosperity much greater than other parts of the United Kingdom. And that is substantially to do with the implications and the impact of the City of London. But of course, there's also a huge amount of inward investment coming into London on a scale that would have been barely imaginable even a decade or so ago. So London is doing extraordinarily well. Is it a problem that London is doing better than the rest of the country? You bet it is. You bet it is. It's a political problem and it's an economic problem. And the government recognized that. And that is why, for example, over the last few weeks, the Chancellor of the Exchequer has announced huge investment programs in parts of the northeast, parts of the northwest, the Midlands, and out in the West Country. Precisely for that reason, it isn't acceptable to have one part of a country move so rapidly in increasing assets and wealth compared to everywhere else. So action is being taken, but it's extraordinarily difficult because the external investor, and we probably have more money pouring into the UK per head of population than anywhere in the world, is devoting so much of it to the London area. So the UK government is going to have to send a good deal of its own money out towards the regions to start closing the gap. And it is difficult because it causes both political and economic divisions. Economic divisions begin, but if you get an economic division in which one part of the country becomes noticeably more wealthy than the others, you will find a counterpoint in terms of political support in other parts of the country. So it straddles both elements of the problem, and my goodness, it does need to be dealt with, and it is beginning to be dealt with. And I think that would happen whomsoever was the government of the United Kingdom. As for China, I'll let Richard have first crack at China.
Let me just say, in the United States, we have the opposite. So New York has been declining in influence significantly. If you actually look at the population growth and the power that it has in our democracy in terms of the Congress, it has not been adding representatives, but that population has moved. People vote with their feet. They move south and west. And so we have this incredible dynamism taking place where other places are becoming much more prosperous than New York City. So we have perhaps a different culture. It's just part of our national ethic. With regard to China, I would only say this. One of the greatest exacerbators of inequality is corruption. And I think President Xi's greatest challenge is to do something about how capital is channeled and who has the easiest access. I understand, watching him through the press and so on, that this is part of his major agenda. So you had the first large leap forward, not to use an old term, but really under Deng Xiaoping, where you had massive economic expansion. But to continue the process, you're going to have to root out corruption and the successive concentration that stems from corruption. I have noticed this week, by the way, most of the stores, particularly the high fashion stores here in Hong Kong, have discounted their prices 20 to 30%. My guess is that's in response to the crackdown on official corruption in China. So it's a difficult task to take on, but I think it's a very important step. So that would limit my comments on China, and I'll let the Prime Minister comment the rest on China.
I'm always a little shy as a former Prime Minister of a country that averages growth of 2.5%.
Exactly.
To say very much about a country that has average growth of over 8% over the last decade or so, I'm not sure that advice from me is particularly required as far as China is concerned. They may regard it as a little impertinent to offer it. I'd say several things about China. Firstly, if you had said to me when I first went to China 40 years ago that China would now be where she is, I would not have believed it. I would not have believed it economically, and I would not have believed the way China has opened up. It may have a long way to go in terms of the freedoms and liberties that we take for granted in other democratic nations. It has got a long way to go in that. But the extent to which it has traveled over recent years has been quite extraordinary. And the decisions that were made at the Central Committee last year about their plans for the next 5 years or so are absolutely mind-boggling when you think of the sheer scale of them. Within 20 years, if they keep to their plans, and they have shown a remarkable ability to keep to their economic plans over the last 2 or 3 decades, if they keep to their economic plans, within 20 years, they will have 1/2, for example, they will have 1/2 of all the railway lines in the whole of the world in one country. Quite extraordinary. The degree of foreign exchange reserves they have built up has been almost beyond imagination. The scale in which they have invested, I spend a large part of my life traveling around the world. And I usually know where I'm going because I'm on the tail of a Chinese minister who's sewing up investment deals and deals about raw materials in almost every continent. Doesn't matter whether you're in Latin America, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in Europe, you'll find a vast range of Chinese ministers going around the world dealing with long-term contracts that will look after the future prosperity of China. I mean, China's always concerned at the raw materials it doesn't have. It's always concerned, increasingly concerned, about its status around the world, and it is taking action to correct that for the future. And whether or not you agree with every aspect of Chinese policy, the scale of what they have achieved is truly remarkable. And I think it is an attractive development for the world that China has emerged from its seclusion in the way that it has. And it's a very interesting relationship that exists, because if you had the two superpowers of 30 years ago, you had a wholly antagonistic position between the United States and Russia. You had NATO and the Warsaw Pact with missiles targeted against one another, and from time to time you wondered whether those missiles would actually be used, the Cuban crisis, for example, and other occasions as well. Of course there are tensions between China and the United States. Of course there are. They are economic rivals and political rivals in some respect. But there isn't the military antagonism between China and the United States that there was between China and the Soviet Union as the two most significant economic and economic powers in the world. And that too I find extremely attractive. So I welcome the emergence of China. I think they have a lot to do in terms of human rights. I think they have a lot to do in terms of the democratic rights of individuals, and there's a very strong argument that democracy is a less practical form of government in terms of achieving things than a degree of autocracy. You can certainly argue that case. But human beings cherish liberty, they cherish freedom, and so they deserve democracy. So there's much there that China has to do. But I think economically and politically, they've made extraordinary strides. And I do think the replacement of the antagonistic Soviet Union with modern-day China has made us a safer world than once we were.
Can I add to that? Because again, I like to use the phrase, we've gone from exactly what Sir John just meant, mutually assured destruction to mutually assured competition. It's a much healthier thing. As you know, they own an enormous amount of US securities, treasuries. This is good, not bad. It's when they want to get rid of them that I'd start getting worried. But I think this is a key point. This is a better world because of what's happened.
One more question, and may I ask that questioners keep your questions brief in the interest of time.
Okay, the members of the panel
could have been a hint to us too.
The members of the panel belong to two wonderful countries with very high GDP per head and just high and rising Gini ratio. Can we learn something from other countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland? Very high GDP per head also, but the Gini ratio much lower. For instance, you mentioned the education system. The vocational schools in Germany, Austria, Switzerland are wonderful examples of what can be learned by somebody else, by the other countries. What are your thoughts of copying something from these three countries to decrease the inequality in the world?
Who cares to start? Sir John?
Well, I don't have much to say. I agree. I think we should. I'm happy to plagiarize good ideas from anywhere, and I don't think we should. I don't think we should turn our nose up at them. There's a huge amount of experience that people have in different countries of different sorts, and if we can learn from that and benefit from that, we should certainly take it. And certainly across the European Union, we do. And I think it's a very attractive suggestion. It's one government should follow. I wish they did it more than they do, but it's certainly the right thing, the right way to proceed, I think.
I thought that was an excellent statement, by the way, that you just made. I will say that we are seeing an interesting phenomenon in the United States. One thing we do have is a strong, what we call community college system in the United States. It's much more vibrant than people know about from abroad. And this helps develop skill sets that, as the Prime Minister said earlier, we don't need necessarily the highest university standards, although we have them. We also need to fill in the middle groups. But the latest development we're seeing are private companies, because of skill shortages, developing their own educational institutions. And that may be one of the answers to provide the basic skill sets that they need. So both of us agree with you.
Thank you for your comments. This is a question about political backlash against the financial industry. I believe the Prime Minister mentioned that a lot of the issues around income inequality were exacerbated after the financial crisis. And, you know, a number of the things that happened, you know, perhaps the finance industry brought upon itself. But it's not productive to have a backlash that goes on for a decade or longer. So I'd be curious to get a perspective from both of you about where we are in the cycle of political backlash against the financial industry and when we could go back to more normal operations.
May I? Yes, of course. We were victims of that backlash at the central bank, at the Federal Reserve. And so part of it had to do with the fact that we stepped in and did what central banks do as lenders of last resort. Ben Bernanke, for example, was placed under the Klieg lights in congressional scrutiny, the Congress being the representative of the people, because in our case in the United States, we had an ineffective Congress that couldn't do a thing and act. And so it's much easier to point your finger at the monetary authority or the enemy, you, than it is to say that I'm unable to make decisions, I'm indecisive and feckless. And that was the situation we found ourselves in. So again, making the enemy out of somebody else takes attention off of yourself. I think that's slowly subsiding, at least in our country. And some of this has to do with excessive concentration among financial institutions. And people forget that the community banks in the United States finance the service clubs, the little leagues, the local synagogues, the local churches, et cetera. And this is not done by these giant institutions that exist in the epicenter financially of New York or say in San Francisco for a rural area in Texas. And you find a declining population base of those community banks. But that process is beginning to run its course. They have risen up. They lobby themselves just as the big banks do, and they've tried to balance out the power. So I think as the crisis subsides, passes, fades into memory, you look in the rearview mirror, there should be less of this antagonism that exists. But it wasn't directly directed at you, it was also directed at us as a central monetary authority, as the enabler of first the mistakes that happened and not properly addressing them after the fact. I think it is subsiding in the United States. However, if we don't deal with this issue of disparity, it's likely not to go away.
I think it'll fade as austerity fades. It's what has been the motivating factor for it. There was some justification for it, frankly. But I think it will fade as austerity fades. But if you forgive me, as someone who is both a banker and a politician, other than being an estate agent, I have all the most unpopular professions you can have. As someone who is a banker and a politician, I come from a profession that faces a constant backlash and has for the last 3,000 years. So I watched the travails of the financial industry over a few years with a certain degree of disattachment.
Thank you. So, John, you alluded to the sort of the benefits of globalization as it relates to the peace dividend and so on. And I think that's actually quite true. But what I think is also interesting is that the flip side of globalization is fractionalization. And I think that's what's actually allowed for the creation and the rise of groups which are actually supranational because of the income disparities and the growth in income disparity. And I'm wondering to what extent we can address those at a national level when these movements are clearly not national organizations.
It's an extremely good question for which I don't have an extremely good answer. And I don't think anyone else does either. It is a real problem as to how you deal with many of these supranational, international organizations. And no one has found a proper way of doing it yet. It could only be done by international cooperation, and there are too many competing international interests for you often to get the cooperation that you actually need. So it is a program that the best I can say to you is work in progress. I don't know of a single government that isn't concerned about that problem. But equally, I don't know of a single government that has found a workable solution to that problem yet. One of the advantages of being an ex-politician is you don't have to pretend you know the answer to a question when you don't.
One of the advantages of being a central banker is that you're used to the practice of not answering the questions that you're asking.
Thank you to both panelists for your comments. Just a quick question on one of the key drivers of inequality, which is healthcare. The two panelists come from countries with very different healthcare systems. The question relates to the Affordable Care Act and whether it is actually something that improves some of the challenges that, that you discussed, and whether you think that is a stabilizing factor going forward for the U.S.
Well, I guess I'll have to make an attempt at answering that. We don't know. It is widely disputed in terms of its ultimate effect. Again, I'm a central banker. I'm not involved. I'm not a politician. I'm not involved in politics. This is a political issue that's been pushed by the current president, attempted by the wife of a former president, by the way. But the real question is, what does it do to the supply of the providers as well as those that are in need of services? And one of the serious issues we have in the United States, and this is outside my purview, but I just observe this as a citizen, is increasingly doctors who no longer want to be in the profession and point at either the Affordable Care Act or the way Medicare reimburses, et cetera, and have decided that it is something they just don't want to profess anymore. So I think you have to look at the supply side as well as the demand side. And we won't know the answer to that until it's worked its way all the way through the system. I have no other comments on that.
Well, just briefly, I don't want to comment on the Affordable Care Act. That would be beyond my wise remit. But a word about health, I think, is worthwhile. In the advanced medical nations of the world, the life expectancy of a child born today would be 90 or 91 years of age. There's no point in saying you can continually raise the retirement age. You might continually raise the retirement age for people in white-collar occupations, but you certainly can't for bricklayers, for roofers, for people engaged in manual work. They simply won't be able to do it. So there is an enormous problem in terms of the cost of healthcare and health provision that is building up for future generations. It's getting more difficult every year. And the more we discover, the more we are making it difficult for ourselves. On the night my first grandchild was born, I happened to be dining with some doctors at the Great Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, which is one of the great teaching hospitals of the world. And I said to them, what does it mean? And they talked about life expectancy. And they also then talked about what was the ailments that we are likely to find a cure for over the next 20 or 25 years. And they are quite extraordinary. The change in treatment for cancer, for example, has been phenomenal, often led by the United States. They've done some remarkable work at places like San Diego. But it's happening also in terms of Alzheimer's, in terms of Parkinson's. Not a cure, but a way of holding the disease at bay is now within the sight of the doctors, the surgeons, and the scientists. And they've now discovered, now they've done a complete mapping of the human genome system, that there are 3.5 billion genes in our bodies, and they've mapped all of them. And out of those 3.5 billion, quite extraordinarily, 99.6% of them are identical, whether you are male, female, Chinese, Asian, African, European, whatever you may be. 99.6% of the genes are absolutely identical, which I found quite extraordinary, but has actually come about as a result of the increasing depth and knowledge of research that modern science is now able to produce. So if we're going to live a child tonight to the age of 90 or 91 in advanced societies, what would it be like in 20 years' time? And the other point they made to me that is relevant, they can now tell you, with a child born tonight, which of the 5 major killers of people is likely to carry that child off after his lifespan. And if they know that, they can determine what they ought to watch for through life, how they ought to treat it, what sort of diet this child ought to have, what regular checkups it ought to have, all of which is going to accelerate life even more. So the problems of health are going to grow exponentially in terms of paying for it. So it is an absolutely mega problem for the politicians. And the Affordable Care Act is set against that, rather like all health systems, going to face a heck of a problem in the years to come.
And these innovations actually are related to this discussion of income inequality. Assuming that people will live longer, that means we'll have more people to deal with, we'll have other issues to deal with. It'll become a question of affordability. That's what we try to address with the Affordable Care Act. Whether it's successful or not is to be seen. But imagine if you have a populace that has extended lifestyles and you have exacerbated income inequality. To me, that's a formula for further unrest. I just want to bring it back to the subject matter.
Now, if I might ask the final question in the 2 minutes remaining, I'd like to ask a question with a bit of a personal element to it. Both of you come from humble backgrounds. We've been talking about inequality, but we haven't been talking about opportunities and social mobility. Do you think that it is harder now than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago to rise the social ladder in your respective countries?
I'm not sure I can offer you a precise answer to that, except I rather fancy that in many ways it is. And I don't quite understand why it should be. As you implied, I came from quite a modest background, and I found a system that enabled me to move through. I think so much depends upon the quality of education, particularly under 10. If you get the education under 10 that is of a sufficiently high quality, then the rest is a matter of your own aptitude and your own luck. And never underestimate luck. It plays a huge part. Anyone who's got to the top of industry or commerce or politics, you can be sure as hell they have been lucky as well as able, and maybe more lucky than able in many of the cases I can immediately think of. So I think a lot depends on the quality of education, and I think it may, in many parts of the world, have got a little more difficult than it was over the last few years. And that focus on education is patchy in different countries around the world. Some of them, you mentioned Singapore earlier, it's a classic illustration where they really focused on education at a young age, and you've seen extraordinary results because of it. In the United Kingdom, a politician said recently, and everyone smiled because it was true, the only thing cleverer in the United Kingdom than a poor Chinese child is a rich Chinese child. And whether that is because coming from a background without wealth focuses determination more than coming from a background that has been comfortable and easy, I suspect there may be something in that, but it's not something it's easy to quantify.
Well, you know my family history, right? My father was imprisoned at the age of 5 as a beggar, sentenced to 7 years in the most brutal prison in Queensland, somehow got out. We went from homeless to Harvard in 1 generation. And I do think it's entirely due to luck, but also a good education. But I'll tell you the true reason for my success is my mother left Shanghai 7 months before I was born. So I was made in China.
Well, I think that is a perfect note to end the event. Thank you so much. So John, Ambassador Fisher, it's been a fantastic session.